All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the program. As always, I am absolutely thrilled that you are here. If you've never checked us out before, we are primarily a commentary and an interview podcast. And today we have an interview for you. On the line with me is Cinda Gault. Cinda, welcome to the program. So glad you're here.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Awesome. Now, Cinda is an author, but there's some things I gotta bounce off of this author because in the process of getting this material together, there's just some questions that have to be asked. So I'll get to that. We're going to talk about the writing and all that good stuff too. She's the author of 3 books: This Godforsaken Place, A Small Compass, and Everything I Hope For are her 3 books. And let me tell you just a little bit about Cinda. She is a person who really has an interest in women's lives and how they live their lives and what affects them and all that other kind of good stuff. Her undergraduate degree in psychology is from the University of Guelph, and that led her to start an agency to help victims of domestic violence. That alone is interesting. We're going to have to talk about that. She followed that up as a stint as a prison guard, and I don't hear that every day. And she has an MA degree in criminology from the University of Toronto. She was inspired to complete a PhD in English from New York University, and she analyzed Canadians' women's writing from the identity years, which is generally referred to from 1965 to 1980. For another book, she wondered why Canada was the only Western country with no abortion law, and found answers in literary depictions. Now, you know I can't let that go by.
Okay.
I have to ask you about that. Her own fiction started with romance and developed into indie literary and historical fiction. Her stories envision tenacious women who will have their adventures, whether in the 19th century wilderness or contemporary urban settings. And her interest in female lives is now taking a new turn as her and her spouse go from 2 sons to 2 granddaughters. Well, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
All right, lot to delve into here. So you are in Canada. Is that where you're from?
Yeah, I'm from Toronto.
From Toronto.
Yeah.
Writing. When did that start to become an interest for you?
I started out not thinking of being a writer. I started out following my interests. And as you outlined there, that sort of took me to when I was an undergrad in the 1970s. I was one of those young feminists running around setting up rape crisis centers and shelters for victims of domestic violence. So those were years. And 1965 to 1980, it's kind of a given that I would have focused in on those years because they were the years that I was coming of age in. And the 2 main social movements in Canada at the time were, number one, second wave feminism, and that what we shared with the Americans as well. It was happening to all of us at the same time. And so all of those issues that came up at the time were very relevant to me because, I was a young woman at the time. But another movement in Canada that would have differed somewhat from the US, not completely though, we were going through, with Pierre Trudeau as our prime minister, we were going through a sort of a Canadian nationalism time where it was a feel good about Canada type of nationalism. And we were very interested in getting to know ourselves and feeling very good about that. So those 2 things came together at the same time and fueled much of my interests at the time. And I went through, after being a prison guard, I went and did my MA. And after I graduated from that, I got the job of my dreams as an executive director of a social service agency. And I hated it.
Really?
I discovered about myself, I do not like managing people. I do not like it to be my job to make somebody else to do their job. That strikes me as being a mummy, and adults are not cute enough to warrant a mummy. So I had to figure out what anything you do for a living is going to involve its challenges and problems and whatever. And I had to decide what would be meaningful enough to me to make all of that worthwhile. And I always loved school. I always loved reading and writing. So I decided writing stories was going to be worth whatever hardship I had to endure.
Mhm.
And at that time, of course, you can make that decision. You still have to make a living. So that's when I decided that I would write a romance. I had never read one before, but now I was consuming them by the dozens. They're tricky little suckers to write, because if you get two people together on page one to fall in love, that's the easy part. But you have to get them fighting for 350 pages and not make either one look like an idiot. So that's the challenge. So I made her a youth bureau police officer, and I made him an owner of a group home. And what they disagreed about was how to bring up children. So there came a day when she had to place one of her juveniles, and the only place in town that had a bed open was in his group home. And so that brought them together and gave them something to fight about, because they each had good points on either side. So that was the beginning of my writing. That was in 1988. That was a Harlequin super romance that was published. It was great fun. It went all around the world, different languages, that sort of thing. And recently, my current publisher wanted to republish it. Because I got my rights back from Harlequin. And so I needed to go through it and revise it for the current day. Very interesting process going back over what you did 37 years ago.
Yeah.
And back then I wrote the thing on a manual typewriter. Anyway, I went back over it. I had typed it on a manual typewriter. I didn't have an electronic copy of it, and I was going to retype the whole thing. And my millennial kids said, "Oh God, Mom, don't do that. You can do an image to text software," so I had to copy in a couple hours. And so I had to go through, I had landlines, I had phone booths, I had tape recorders, all that sort of things. There were no cell phones, there were no computers. So I needed to update the technology, but it was an interesting experience because the romance held, which was kind of reassuring that people fall in love now the way they always have. And so that was the beginning. And after that, I decided I would go back to school in English, because all I knew about was social science up to that time. I had been in psychology and criminology. And so I went back, picked up courses, went on to do another MA, this time in English, and then I caught the bug academically and went on to do a PhD. It's at York University in Toronto. I've never gone to school in the United States.
Okay, I misread that. My apologies.
That's okay.
You know, it's that program that's American in the brain. You know, you
I
see
think
York,
so.
it's New York.
It has to be a new in front of it. So I went through and did my MA or my PhD, and I did it on three female Canadian writers who came to publishing prominence during the years 1965 to 1980. And they were Margaret Atwood, Margaret Lawrence, and Marian Engel. And during that time, I also decided to have my babies. So that was also all at the same time. And when they mercifully went off to university themselves and I finished my degree, I had time to write again. And that's when I started writing the three historical fiction novels that you mentioned.
Yes.
So that's how I got into it.
That's pretty, that's awesome. Well, you say you have a great background, a lot to draw on. And I think that's important for a writer. They say it's hard to be a good writer under the age of 30. With other things like singing and dancing, you have to start young. But 30 for writing is generally because you have to have the lived, and in the passage of time, I think is hard to explain to somebody. You really have to experience that. The social constructs change and all that type of thing. You have to be alive for that. But you also obviously lots of education, lots of draw on. That's fantastic. One of the things that you chose on my production sheet here is asking about what it was like to live in the 1970s. Now, I'm of the age where I was there, but I have a feeling my experience was a little different than what you're going to tell me about. What was life like in the 1970s?
Well, you've just piqued my curiosity. You need to give me an overall idea of how you think it's different.
Well, you mentioned the feminism, and I see touches of that. I'm going to get into that. So my suspicions are going like, you have to ask bring in a permission slip from your husband to get birth control from your doctor. That's kind of where I suspected you were going to go. Now, I may be wrong.
Well, how was it different for you than what you think I'm going to say?
Well, I was in grade school, and the 70s were a party. The 70s here in the United States, they say life was simpler back then, and that's kind of a cliche. But we could make do with riding on our bikes, throwing things in the backyard. We were very active. And we didn't spend all day looking at our phones, looking at iPads. I think life was experienced by my experience of it. As a young boy was probably more exciting. And I did things, that typical things back then. Evel Knievel. Do you remember Evel Knievel?
Yes, I do.
Okay. I set my bike on fire one time and went over a ramp. And that's the type of thing that, there'll be an app for that now. There'll be an Evel Knievel app, and the kids just sit on the living room floor. And now, don't get me wrong, I probably shouldn't have done that. I ended up in the emergency room a couple of times during my childhood, but at least, you were experiencing life. You weren't sitting on the floor, just tapping an iPad and doing the Evel Knievel app. That's what would be today if that was a thing. So anyway, that's my answer.
Okay, that's a good answer. That also tells me that you're probably younger than I am, because you were in grade school at that time, and I was an undergrad in university.
Yeah.
So that obviously is a big difference, and it would have been very different for young men in the States at that time than it would be for young men in Canada. And obviously it was different from you because they were being drafted for the Vietnam War.
Absolutely.
So we had draft dodgers come up here. And that's how we would have experienced that. There would have been a lot of sort of overlap because of the whole student movement at the time. And the long-haired hippie kind of thing was here as much as it was in the US. It's just that the political differences made life more dire for young men in the States than it did for them here. So what I would characterize as the 70s from my point of view, I was a young woman at the time. I was in my early 20s going to university, and it was a heady, exciting time because you had so many things changing for women at the time. You mentioned the pill. Well, it wasn't just getting your husband's permission, because we didn't have husbands. We were in our early 20s. But the pill just became like a mass-produced thing that everybody could get a hold of. And it was the sexual revolution. So there was, what you would have had as constraints in earlier generations was not the case. You had women being able to go into jobs that they had never been allowed to go in. Like I couldn't have been a prison guard in a men's prison before. So now I could do something like that. You had women going back to school, going on to post-secondary education in droves. Everything has flipped since then. It was more men going to university then. It's more women now. And so everything seemed to be possible as a young woman. You could do anything that you wanted. And my mother's generation was the 50s housewife generation that started the whole second wave movement, the Betty Friedan feminine mystique thing. So they were kind of a resentful generation in some ways because they didn't want to be restricted to being housewives. They wanted to do other things as well. So the idea of their daughters being able to go on and do whatever they wanted was something that my generation fought for and benefited from in that way. And they say the sexual revolution happened between the sheets, which was quite true in the sense that you would be involved in these debates about sexuality, about reproduction, about all of those things with whoever you were going out with at the time. It was very real. Those issues were very real. So that was the 70s to me. And of course, the music in my book, each chapter is the title of a different song from the 70s. That was very important to people back then as well. The 60s and 70s, the music was experienced as very relevant and dynamic because you had a whole new genre of music that was being invented, rock and roll. And there was an energy and an excitement to that.
Yeah. I would personally really strongly agree with you on that. Even though I was very young at the time, most of my career has been involved with, professional audio, things like that.
Right.
And even during the 70s, there was, if you remember the word hi-fi.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you how this has changed. This might be a perspective that you haven't heard, but it's in line with what you just said. In the 1970s and is somewhat into the 80s, there was a sense of community around music. For example, Pink Floyd or one of those kind of groups come out with a major album. It was often an event to go over to somebody's house on Friday night. They had their hi-fi at the time all set up with the speakers and, food and beverage and other things, I'm sure, during the 1970s, the smoke and so on. And they listened to the music and then they all discussed it, especially with some of the stuff that, like you were talking about, with tied into social change and so on and so forth. You don't have that now. First of all, the music itself is very synthetic, and everybody has a set of buds in their ears in their own little world. And that sense of community with what the music industry was at the time, I think, is gone in a lot of ways. So that's my perspective on that. I think there's so many things that are gone from that era that are hurting us now.
Yeah. And it's interesting, when my kids were sort of 10, 12-ish, so they were born in the late 80s. So this would have been the late 90s. One year as Christmas stocking stuffers, we put in Abbey Road, a CD of Abbey Road, and in the other, we put a Led Zeppelin CD in. Yeah. They couldn't believe it. They were bowled over it. So this is not, you had to live through the 70s to be able to appreciate the music. They could feel the excitement of it and the originality of it. And then, of course, they discovered Janis Joplin, and I could just hear my son's breathing as he listened to it. He couldn't imagine this based on the music that they knew about. It's, since then, music has had to become, by definition, derivative, because that was an invention of a whole new genre of music. Yeah. So everything coming after the invention is now, based on, it has to be derivative. It's not as if there hasn't been good music, but I get what you're saying, and it's true. Yeah. But there other generations can feel it when they hear it.
Yes, I just wish it wasn't reflecting on history. I wish it was.
Yeah, I know.
Part of our society. Okay,
I know.
Speaking about your progressive leanings, I have to ask, because this is really intrigued me. I just really discovered recently about abortion laws in Canada. I just discovered about that recently. I wasn't aware of that. Yeah. It doesn't seem like that is an issue in Canada. Why is that? Why and how did you discover this in your literary endeavors?
Okay, well, it historically, I mean, this was part of living through the 70s, because we had a doctor named Henry Morgenthaler. I don't suppose you've ever heard of him.
I've heard that name. I can't not placing.
He was an absolute giant on the landscape in the 70s. Okay. A fascinating man. He was in Auschwitz during the Second World War. Yeah, and when he was liberated, he eventually wound up in Montreal in Canada. And he had been through such a horrendous experience that he wanted to do something with his life that felt important. And what he dedicated himself to was giving women, he was also a medical doctor, giving women the chance to be autonomous about their own bodies. And this was very, very resonant with Canada at the time, because Pierre Trudeau wanted to bring the Constitution home from England and wanted to give Canada its own charter of rights and its own constitution to make its own choices and its own decisions about how it would govern itself, how it would govern its own body politic. So you had a lot of the same language was being used for the country as it was for women. When you said, I want to be autonomous, Canadians understood that because they wanted to be autonomous too. So there was a lot of sympathy for women at the time. We went through a different history as far as getting women's rights at the time. It was much more of a middle class women convincing their professional and political husbands to change laws than fighting in the streets so much. I mean, we had protests and everything, but Henry Morgentaler challenged the nation and eventually brought the nation to its knees over this. And it was very much him who did it. He openly did abortions so that the nation would have to confront him over it. And at the time, you had abortion laws changing in the 60s. In 1968, Pierre Trudeau changed the law so that there were what we called therapeutic abortion committees, so that you had to have 3 doctors in a hospital agree that an abortion was necessary. Well, before that, it had been up to an individual doctor, and the defense was necessity. And it was the individual doctor who decided on whether or not an abortion was necessary for a woman's not only physical health, but mental health as well. So that had been his defense up until the law was changed. And now you had to have an abortion committee. It wasn't up to an individual doctor anymore. So that landed him in jail for a while because the Quebec government did something completely illegal and threw him into jail. And that was corrected afterwards, so it couldn't happen again. But he went through many court cases and no jury would convict him. He argued defense, necessity as his defense. And even when that wasn't technically the law anymore, the jury still wouldn't convict him. So it eventually went up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and in 1988, it was struck down. Now, it was struck down for other technical reasons. For example, there are so many remote places in Canada that would not have a hospital with 3 doctors being on a committee. So if it doesn't exist, you don't have equality of opportunity across the country if so much of the country does not have the opportunity to construct such a committee. So there were other technical things involved in it, but it was struck down. So in order for a law to then, it had been in the criminal code since the late 1800s. So in order to come up with another law, you had to have consensus of, I think, at least 2/3. Well, that's like herding cats, isn't it? You know, you wouldn't get that in the States, and you certainly wouldn't get it in Canada. So what we do, we just sit without a law. And the fight is over funding, which is at a provincial level. That would be like at the state level for you, but not whether or not it's legal, because nobody would be able to get a consensus of any sort as to that we need a new law or what that new law would be if we did. So I was curious about this because that lands us as the only Western country that does not have an abortion law. And I was curious about how that happened, just like you are. So I used my expertise and went back looking at novels that were written by Canadians, and trying to understand how it is they used this as a symbol in their books to understand the cultural underpinnings of how we wound up like this. And I noticed that that each author that I analyzed used it in the sense that it was back off and mind your own business. Whether it was based on class or race or ethnicity or gender or whatever, the message was, you don't have, keep your opinions to yourself. We live in a culture that makes room for people having their own opinions about themselves. And I theorize that a lot of this has to do with Canada as a nation, how we started out. I mean, America is known as the melting pot, and everybody knows what America stands for. It's freedom, it's the American dream, and no matter where you come from, you're American once you get here. That's not the case in Canada because our culture has been split at the root from the beginning. We were made up, France and England fought tooth and nail for centuries over in Europe. And then they came over here and they fought tooth and nail over here. But there weren't very many people over here. So one ship coming up the St. Lawrence could decide who was going to run the country. And at the time, Americans were going through their War of Independence. And you have so much thanks that you do give to Lafayette, because he decided he was going to fight for troops and money for you and not for us. So that meant that the one ship coming up the St. Lawrence that was going to determine everything was a British ship and not a French ship. And that's all it took. Mm-hmm. So now we say, okay, well, we beat you at the Plains of Abraham. We've got the country. Let's be friends now. Okay, we're all here. It's really hard getting through the winters here. Why don't we just all be a country and be friends? And so that's kind of, so in order to survive, you had to acknowledge that you were two very different cultures in the same space, different languages, different histories, different everything. And that was not the case with the US. We also have much less of a Bible Belt here. It's just bigger in the States, as everything is. So I think there's more of a sensitivity in Canada to leave people be with their own ideas about autonomy, what they want to do with themselves. And there's not a pressure to, as much of a pressure to, well, it's a perennial question among Canadians. What does it mean to be a Canadian? And you'd get a million different answers, except that we're nice and we have big teeth and we smile a lot and we don't think anybody wants to be unkind to us. But other than that, we don't have that one singular identity piece that Americans have. So the idea is that you give people room. Yes. And I think that was played out in the novels that I read. Yes.
That's some interesting stuff. I got to tell you, I kind of figured you were going to bring a lot to this interview, and you have fantastic perspectives here. I got to tell you, I think in terms of the religious right, I'm not personally religious one way or the other. I just don't really, I'm not really governed that much by beliefs in general. And there was a time when I was much more critical of the right than I am now. I agree with you there for a while during the 1980s and during the 1990s. The evangelicals wielded a lot of power in our government. And I would always get nervous when one of them won an election, because they would say things like, well, God has spoken, when they that's exactly what our founding fathers said. Don't do it. You don't want to claim divine providence in an election. That's the last thing you want to do. Okay. Don't do it. But as the years have gone on, I think the tide has turned the other way now. I think, people who want to express their beliefs for whatever reason and talk about Jesus or whatever as, part of what drives them, part of their identity, a lot of times they feel like they need to keep that quiet. They don't want to be perceived as a religious zealot or someone with a closed mind. And I've actually started to have a little sympathy for them now. The Charlie Kirk shooting was a prime example of that. I got to tell you, some of the things that I saw online, some of the from the left celebrating and mocking the shooting would be something that you would never tolerate from the religious right. So I started to become a little bit more sympathetic to their existence. They should be able to talk about their rights, talk about their beliefs as much as anybody else. Is that something you've perceived, or am I wrong here in terms of what happened on your side of the fence?
No, I agree with you, and I think part and parcel what has happened, and I have experienced this personally, going to school going to university in the 1970s, and then I went back to school as what we call a reentry student. And I went back to school when my kids were going to school. We were all going through at the same time. So I had the experience of going through the whole thing all over again, years after what, when you're in school, you think that what you learn in school, that's kind of what the world is all about. Yeah. And then I go back and the whole thing has changed. And what happened in the 1970s is that the educated intelligentsia class turned hard left.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was a liberal back then, and the Liberal Party left me in the sense that it went off the rails. And what a lot of that was, when I came back years later and went through school again, is it had just gotten more rabid. And part of what you had, most of your reading, I mean, I was in the humanities, so much of your theoretical reading was Marxist.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has taken, like, when I realize I'm part of this, in that when in the 70s, the women's movement was all about identity. I wrote my thesis on female and Canadian identity in the years 1965 to 1980 without anticipating that running right off the rails the way it did. So I think we flogged the identity horse to death.
Yeah.
In my opinion, it did useful things at the time. I mean, there were things that had to be challenged. The rape laws needed to be changed. Women needed to be able to get their own loans at the bank.
Sure.
There were all kinds of things that needed to be changed. And I found men very open to wanting to make things fair at the time.
Yeah.
But identity has been taken to the point that it is like meaningless now. And I think that it's a bit hypocritical for women to have the power that they have now and still be talking as though it's the 1950s.
Yes.
So there's a responsibility that comes with power. And I think that what has happened is equality has kind of shifted into the idea of equity.
Yes.
And without anybody really noticing, I guess, our attitude in the second wave was get out of my way. I don't need you to protect me. I don't need you to do anything for me. Just don't tell me I can't do this and I can't do this and I can't do this. Now it seems as if there's a sense that society owes protection. Even if you take risks, you still must be protected. You can't do that.
Yeah.
You can't have the freedom over your autonomy. If someone else, it almost seems Victorian to me that you need a chaperone or something. Well, that's not being responsible for yourself, and it's not being free.
Yeah.
So there have been some theoretical bogs that I think have happened since then. There will always be abuse of power. There will always be bad people doing bad things. And what we were expecting from our society at the time was that society needs to do whatever it can do to be even-handed. And I'm pretty impressed at how far it came to do that. Bad things are still going to happen, though. And men are going to be stronger than women physically. And testosterone can make you really stupid from time to time. And I say this because I have two sons, and they would completely agree with me. But when you think of it, it's a very small percentage of men who do the bad things.
Yes.
Most men are great.
That's, I'll close this part of the subject out. I think so much of what you said about acknowledging progress in the American leftist movement right now, which in the last couple of years has gone, left out the window. Okay. Somebody like one of our most popular presidents, Kennedy, who was considered a progressive at the time, he in no way, shape, or form would qualify as a liberal today.
Yeah.
And they won't. That's one thing I've noticed. They won't acknowledge any progress. Men are pigs. This is the worst country in the world. And they won't acknowledge that anything has gotten any better since 1945. And that's not to say that there isn't work to be done, but I do agree that any type of social progress, that we've come a long way in a lot of different ways. And I just wish that people would at least acknowledge that so we could all agree on what the problems still are.
Yeah. And, the feminist movement at the time when I was involved in it, the whole idea was that you wanted to work yourself out of a job. It was our job to say, this isn't fair, this isn't fair, this isn't fair. Let's fix it. And then we don't need a feminist movement anymore.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we forget that the goal is to see each other as individuals, that to see each other as people. And I really found that having two boys, it really gives you a respect for the power of personality. If I had had a girl and a boy, I would have been presuming all kinds of differences based on sex. And instead, they were like night and day in many ways because they were two different people.
Sure.
And I think that we miss out a lot on the richness of the human being by trying to shove people into categories and have expectations about them that way.
Yes. And everybody's got some kind of badge now. I don't care. It's your religion, it's your race, it's your sexuality. Everybody's got a badge and everybody belongs to a club. And I don't know that's serving us well. I got to ask you about this too. I'm pretty good with post-Civil War in terms of history up till now, especially here in the United States, what happened post-Civil War up to now. And I know who Annie Oakley is.
Okay.
You make a comparison here that Annie Oakley was the Wayne Gretzky of her times.
Yeah.
I know who Wayne Gretzky is. I probably don't know as much about him as you do. But
Canadian boy.
Yeah. What's the comparison there?
I say that Annie Oakley was the Wayne Gretzky of her time with a rifle in her hands instead of a hockey stick. Wayne Gretzky was so far and away better than anyone else at doing what he was doing. And so was Annie Oakley. I suspect there was a certain perceptual thing with both of them that they were just born with. And she could, you know, she was in a man's sport, being shooting rifles, and she was just so much better than anybody. And I found her fascinating as a person. She was sort of the epitome of a feminist in that she was kicking male butt everywhere in what she was doing every single day, but she was not aligned with the women's movements at the time. She was not at all. So you would probably hear much more about her if she were a heroine of the political left, but she was not.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
That's an interesting comparison there. You know, one of the things that you talk about is what does and does not survive history. And I know there's an old saying that the history is written by the victors. That's what you often hear. And I think that's true to a point. And I can tell you in one case where it didn't happen, and that's in the American Civil War. For whatever reason, the South, the writers in the South, the papers in the South, the universities in the South documented post-Civil War in the United States. And that's how General Lee became a hero. General Grant became a butcher. And I'm not exactly sure why that happened, but that's one time when the losers wrote the story. What is when you talk about what does and what doesn't survive history? What are you referring to?
Well, I was referring to it in more individual story terms. Kind of what we know about ancestors. You know, we know facts. You know, you can probably find out what do you know about your great grandparents, for example. You can find out when they were born, when they got married, when they had kids, when they died, and those are the facts that you know, and you probably don't know much more about them. I mean, if you were lucky enough that somebody wrote a journal that came down through the generations, you would know more about them. But the things that don't survive are their hopes, their dreams, their disappointments, their secrets, their, you know, the sort of the human aspect of it. And that's what a writer breathes back into the story. And the thing that really hit me about this was I was researching for my first novel, this Godforsaken Place, and I came across a fur trader's journal from earlier in the century in 1806. And there was an asterisk, and down at the bottom of the page, it said, "An extraordinary thing happened tonight. One of Mr. Haney's Orkney lads," and just to let you know, the Hudson's Bay Company hired young Scottish men from Orkney in Stromness. Apparently, they were easier to control than their British counterparts, who were quite unruly. But the Scot farmers were, you know, more complacent, temperament-wise, and so in this little asterisk at the bottom of the page, it said one of Mr. Haney's Orkney lads asked to stay behind tonight and warm himself by the fire. And I told him that was fine. I went up to bed. And then a short time later, one of my employees came and knocked on my door and told me I had to come down. And I went down, and there, among much lamentation, was an Orkney lad in the middle of giving birth on the hearth. Mm. And my head exploded. This is a story that is demanding to be told. Mm. So I wanted to go out and find out who she was and tell her story. And I discovered her name was Isabel Gunn. She had cut her hair, disguised herself as a man, got hired on by the Hudson's Bay Company to come over and work in the fur trade. And she lasted 18 months, and she was outed by having a baby on the hearth of a fur trading company. It was in Canada then. It's in North Dakota now, a place called Pembina. So I went out. I wanted to write that story, and I discovered very soon after that some other writer had beaten me to the punch and wrote the story already. So I read the story, and I was flabbergasted by how differently I saw that story compared to how the other writer did. So we're working with the same facts. We're working with the same things that came down through history. But what we would breathe back into the story would be completely different as far as who she was, what she sounded like, what her motivations were, who the people around her were, how she accomplished the things that she accomplished. And that's what doesn't survive history. And that's what you make up and put back. And I had lots of, the research I had was very rich. Hudson's Bay Company has an entire building for their archives in Winnipeg. And I had the captain's manifest for the voyage over. I knew everything that the employees did on that ship on the way over. Every day I knew what the weather was. I knew, whether they were tarring the deck or whether they were making the nets or whatever they were doing. And then when they got here, Hudson's Bay fur trading post is called a factory, and the guy who ran it was called a factor, and part of his job was to write down every day what all the employees were doing. So he was writing down what John Fubister was doing every day, and I knew that was Isabel Gunn. So I had lots of facts, but the things that don't survive history, I still had to make up. So that's what I meant by that. So when I'm telling her story, and then I found out about another woman who was in the same place, the same time, another non-Indigenous woman who went out, completely different story. And they, in reality, they were at the same place, same time, and had their babies a week apart from each other. You can't make this stuff up. Right. And there was no record of them ever having met. So that became my story. Interesting. I'll ask you one more question about your writing. You touched on a little bit, but you seem to have an affinity, I would say an affection for writing historical stories. Is it just because you appreciate those time periods? Is it you can imagine a story happening in those situations a little better? What is it about that? Well, I think it has more to do with my education because I'm a Canadianist, so this is my jam is to go back into these, into history, in Canadian history. So my first novel was a romance, so that was contemporary. And then I went back into the 1885. When I started researching for that, I started researching the Jesse James gang because I had just finished, many years of doing a PhD and bringing up two kids. And I had these two huge responsibilities on my shoulders for so long that when I graduated and they went off to university and I suddenly had some time to devote to something that I wanted to do, I felt like galloping over the plains with the wind in my hair, being as free as I possibly could. So I just thought, I'll research the Jesse James gang because they got to ride horses and do whatever they wanted to do. And while I was researching them, I was surprised by how close American and Canadian history were at the time, because just over the border, you had the Louis Riel Rebellion going on. And after that failed, Gabriel Dumont, who was Louis Riel's right-hand general, he escaped down into the States for political refuge after. And when I discovered that I found him an interesting guy because he was a military general. very talented, good tactician from all accounts. And probably if he had been given free rein, that rebellion could have turned out very differently. But Louis Riel kept on saying to him, God doesn't want you to do that. So he was fighting a war with one hand tied behind his back. And I was surprised that a military man would do that, that he'd stand back like that. I would have expected him to fight more for what he thought he could do. Anyway, he wound up at the Bill Cody Wild West show in New York, and at the same time that Annie Oakley did. And I was fascinated with her. So that gave me a destination for the epic journey that I was going to send my fictional protagonist on. As far as that started me writing an historical. And then it was while I was researching for that one that I came across that little footnote that initiated the second one. And then the third one was different because it was a time I didn't have to research because I lived through it. But apparently, if the story is more than half set, at least 50 years ago, it's historical. So most of it's in 1972. So I'm walking, hot talking historical here. So that's how those three came. My next book that I'm going to write is going to be a more contemporary book. So it's not as if I've decided that I'm only going to write historical. I actually have a children's book coming out this year. And then the abortion book that you were talking about, it has been published already, but it's going to be republished by my current publisher. So that's a nonfiction book. So it's not as if I'm married to historical fiction. I just find a whole lot of things interesting.
Yeah. You mentioned Jesse James, and that kind of ties into what I said earlier. I'd be curious if you'd agree with me on this or not. Jesse James was one of those characters that was romanticized largely by the South. This was post-Civil War, and the Southern papers and the Southern writers championed him because he was antagonizing what were perceived as power structures in the North as far as the railroad owners.
Yeah, the carpetbagger kind of thing.
Yeah. And he was a criminal.
Yeah,
I know he's made out to be some sort of like a Peter Robin Hood. But he wasn't that. No.
But he got to ride horses.
He did ride horses. Absolutely new. Well, I got to tell you, we have been talking to Cinda Gault, and this has been a fascinating conversation. I'd love to have you on again.
I'd love to come on again.
3 books: Everything I Hope For, A Small Compass, and This Godforsaken Place. 3 books. Where can people find these books?
Well, you can get them from you can get them on Amazon, as you can get everything on Amazon. You can also get it from my publisher, Grey Goose Press. You can also go to my website. If you Google my name, all of this stuff comes up. And on my website, if you express interest in the book, there's a link that you can click that will take you to be able to buy it straight from the publisher.
Yes. Interesting. It's so nice. A social media presence. Do you want to mention that?
Well, if you Google my name, my Facebook, Instagram, X, everything comes up with that.
You're on X. That's fantastic. I didn't find you on X. I'll have to find you on X.
Okay. And LinkedIn and, all of the stuff that you're supposed to do these days while you're promoting.
Yes. Well, a contemporary bit of news today. It's kind of connected to the history that we both have. Prince Andrew seems to be in a lot of trouble.
Yes, he does.
Yes, he was arrested today.
Yeah, and the American women's Olympic team beat the Canadians.
Oh.
But I suspect we'll get our revenge when the men meet.
Okay. You might very well. Again, This Godforsaken Place, A Small Compass, Everything I Hope For, the books, Cinda Gault, the author. So thank you so much for being here, Cinda.
It was lovely to meet you.
Yeah, likewise. My name is Billy Dees. You can find the Billy Dees podcast anywhere podcasts are found. We are on all the major podcast platforms, and we have over a 10-year history now. So we're real easy to find anywhere you find podcasts. You can find me on X at Billy Dees. Real easy to find. That's kind of like my social media home. X is very trending. It's very topical. It's very real time, and it fits in with podcasting very well. Thank you very much for listening to us today, and we will talk to you again very soon.
Thank you for listening to the Billy Dees podcast. Follow Billy Dees on X @BillyDees for updates about the program.
Do you listen to music or audiobooks on streaming devices such as Sonos or Amazon speakers? How about on your car sound system? If you use Spotify, Audible, or Amazon Music on any of these systems, you can also listen to the Billy Dees podcast the same way. Billy and his team go the extra mile to make sure our podcasts sound as good or better than anything on the radio. Listening to the Billy Dees podcast has never been easier. You literally just have to ask.